Before we launch into this video, I want to make something clear. It's unusual for me to hate a book, with DNFs being a rare occurrence. And when it comes to most of the books on this list, I liked them. I thought the authors did a good job, I've praised the work of some on this channel, and I have no real complaints against any of the books in question. That said, when you like something but don't love it, there can be something of a disconnect when you see everybody else raving about a book. Some of it comes down to the writing. In other cases, it could be a case of my taste changing. And it could be my personal preferences, which no amount of talent can compensate for. Whatever my reasons, which I'll go into for each novel, there were 6 books I enjoyed, but couldn't love, despite my desire to do so. The first story I want to discuss is the Last Hours trilogy. When it comes to Cassandra Clare, my feelings are complicated. When I first discovered her books as a teenager, I was obsessed. I read the Infernal Devices trilogy after picking up the first book in my school library, and I was hooked. The books reminded me of Harry Potter, my childhood favorite, but they dealt with more mature content, dealing with sacrifice, drug addiction, and relationship angst. Cassandra Clare, along with Stephanie Meyer, yanked me onto the YA train. Tearing through the trilogy and buying the third when it wasn't available at my library, I then immediately purchased the whole of the Mortal Instruments. I bought them brand new at Chapters. I spent $100 on books that day, and my parents thought I was crazy, but I wasn't disappointed. While Infernal Devices remained my favorite of the Shadowhunters series, I adored the Mortal Instruments. The books were also the earliest exposure I can remember having to gay relationships and how kids navigate that. Clare was one of my favorite authors ever, but as I grew older, I moved on to other books and forgot about her for a time. Then, when I was in my early 20s, I picked up her Dark Artifices trilogy, and I was nervous. I wasn't a teenager anymore, which meant there was a risk I wouldn't respond to her work the same way. However, I loved the Dark Artifices, which prompted me to return to Clare's work. It wasn't until I read The Last Hours that I felt the disconnect, and I wondered if it was the books themselves, or if I had simply outgrown Clare's writing to a degree. Given my response to Dark Artifices, I didn't feel I could blame age completely. Certainly it was a factor, as when I went to read Infernal Devices again, it didn't hit me the same way as when I was a kid. I still enjoyed it, but again, age couldn't be the only factor, because I still like Infernal Devices more than The Last Hours. All in all, I liked The Last Hours. I was disappointed though, because I wanted to love them, and Cassandra Clare had always been one of my favorite authors. I still have to go back and reread The Mortal Instruments. I barely remember anything from them, so it would be like reading something new, allowing me to look at the work with fresh eyes. The subject of how I feel about Cassandra Clare is something which requires its own video, but I will say that in regards to The Last Hours, it didn't pop as much as the others did. As other readers have pointed out, similar plot points were used. I also found that the characters weren't as memorable as their predecessors, and I didn't feel like I was reading something from the 1800s so much as reading about the 2020s with an 1800s skin. There were ideas I liked, and Grace's plotline was one which stood out to me, but it didn't have me on the edge of my seat the way Dark Artifices did. Again, I want to dig deeper into my feelings on Clare in another video, but I couldn't bring myself to love The Last Hours. Second on my list, we have The Wizard of Earthsea. Most of these books were solid 4 stars from me, but only Tombs of Atuan came close to that 5-star mark, and overall, I wasn't obsessed with the books. To be clear, I really enjoyed them, and Ursula K Le Guin was ahead of her time. Featuring a colored cast in a book written decades ago, she pushed the envelope on what writers could do back then. I'd like to see the series made into a television show, as it would offer an opportunity for diverse casting without needing to alter the source material. Moreover, the book explored important themes, including the differences between men and women, the price of power, the effect of aging, and the value of making your own choices, even when others feel you're selling yourself short. They're important books, and I'd gladly read them to my children. But I didn't lie awake at night thinking about them, and it could simply be the fact that I read them when I was older. This isn't to say they're juvenile, because they're not, and I kept asking myself if they were intended for a middle grade audience, since the content was deeper and more mature than I was expecting. The books are slower, which might help to explain why they're not as mainstream. But again, I'm not opposed to slower books. I honestly can't say why the books didn't hook me more. Because if I do discuss them, all I can come up with is praise. I do know that many who are fans of the books read them when they were younger, so it could be that I missed the chance to develop a nostalgia bias. But who can say? If someone else could offer insight into why I didn't click with them more, I'd love to hear it, since I consider them not only great books, but unique books, doing things I haven't seen other series do. As a quick aside, be sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Third on this list, we have Left Hand of Darkness. As with Wizard of Earthsea, this other classic by Le Guin impressed me, but I didn't love it, even though I wanted to. Based on the synopsis alone, I was excited to read this book. It was one of those stories I expected to be a 5-star from the get-go, just based on my tastes. And when I recall the story, there's nothing I can complain about. I liked the characters, there was actually a fair amount of action, and I'd read it again. The world building was cool, no pun intended, and I loved the idea of humanity spreading across distant planets, with each group evolving differently. In the case of the planet where this story takes place, humans have developed the ability to switch between sexes and genders, changing the way their society functions and highlighting what the world could look like if sex and gender didn't define us the way they do in our own society. Given the date the book was published, 1969, it's all the more impressive that Ursula K Le Guin wrote a book about what is essentially a gender-fluid intersex society, especially when, again, most of the characters were darker-skinned in a time when minority groups were still battling for their civil rights. It may be Ursula K Le Guin's writing style. It could be that, given the ideas she explores, I'd have liked something more dramatic. It may be that I'm too used to books where people overthrow their flawed systems, whereas in Le Guin's books, endings are often bittersweet, though more realistic, with characters having to compromise and accept their losses. I will say that I wasn't happy about the ending of this book. When I see a character go through so much, the last thing I want is such a tragic twist. But again, that could be my own bias. I'm too used to books that wrap everything up with a happy ending, and I respect K Le Guin for challenging that. The fourth series I want to discuss is Discworld. In fairness, I've only read one book from the series, and it's possible I started with one of the weaker entries. I wouldn't be opposed to trying the series again, though a part of me has hesitated because of how many books there are. Even as someone who reads long series, 40 books is an intimidating number, especially when there's so much discourse around where to start. Moreover, Discworld doesn't line up with my personal tastes, at least not on the surface. Generally speaking, I'm quite serious. I like books which are angsty, emotional, and dark. I like my stories, even my fantasies, to be grounded in reality to some degree, and while I appreciate whimsy and magic, I like them to be complemented by darker content. To use an example, Harry Potter can be silly, but there's a moodier undertone. And with the Discworld book I read, I didn't get that. Of course, serious as I am, and struggle as I do with stories that are more comedic, I'm not immune to absurdity. While I don't always appreciate satire, I have loved stories that fall into these categories, including everything from Harry Potter to Calvin and Hobbes. I'm hardly a curmudgeon that hates to laugh, which is why I want to give these stories a chance. The book I started with was Little Wee Men, and any Discworld fans watching can tell me if that's one of the weaker entries or not. But I wasn't impressed by the wee men themselves. To me, they seemed like a bunch of exaggerated Scottish Smurfs, and my overly analytical brain was hung up on why an alien species would be talking and acting like stereotypical Scottish people. What I do remember liking was the whole idea of the witches, and how different planets had their own materials, which led to varying types of witches. I clearly remember the Chalk Witch, and how she had to struggle because of how Chalk Witches were perceived as being weaker. And I appreciated that. Unique world building and magic systems always earn praise from me. To that end, I would like to give Discworld another chance, though with my TBR being what it is, it will likely be some time before I do so. If there's one book that's hyped online, it's Percy Jackson. When it comes to the original Percy Jackson books, I've actually read the series twice. Once when I was transitioning from middle school to high school, and again 2 years ago as an adult. Even as a teenager, I wasn't obsessed. I did love the first book, but found my interest waning towards the end. In reading them as an adult, I wanted to see if my feelings had changed, and to some degree they had. For a start, I had a greater knowledge of Greek mythology, so there was more context. Furthermore, when it came to the relationships and the themes the books address, I appreciated what Riordan did. I love the characters, and Percy, Annabeth, and Grover are endearing. Percy's brother, Tyson, was as huggable as ever too. I still wouldn't say these books are better than Harry Potter. I could be biased since Harry Potter represents my childhood, and I'll never be able to look at the books without lingering nostalgia, but I find Harry Potter deeper. It helps that the Potter books are longer, allowing more room for subplots and additional characters. But I also find Harry Potter more serious. This isn't to say Percy Jackson doesn't have its moments, but the overall tone, especially of the later Potter books, was more mature. Percy Jackson is more whimsical, which meant I did find some of the humor and events kind of silly, but I recognize that that's the point, and that my own tastes are to blame for any disappointment on that front. I will say that, for whatever reason, I love the party centers. Absurd as they are, those guys make me laugh. In the future, I wouldn't be opposed to reading the sequel series Riordan wrote, but as with Discworld, they're not at the top of my list. Finally, we have Mr. Norrell and Jonathan Strange. Out of all the books on this list, this is the only one I DNF'd. And it was all the more disappointing because, based on a synopsis, this seemed like a book that was written for me. It takes place in a historical setting, it has a society dedicated to magic, there are fae playing tricks on people, and it's long with rich writing. These are all elements I love. As noted in one of my recent videos though, in which I talk about why I'll DNF a book, I mentioned how, with this book, I felt a lack of connection with the characters. I didn't find them badly written per se, but I felt like the writing style kept me at arm's length from them, and I was struggling to see what point the book was trying to make. As said in my last point, Percy Jackson could still hold me, despite not being my cup of tea, because I liked the characters. If nothing else works, I'll always consider the people that populate a story. I'm a character-oriented reader, and if I'm not gelling with the people in a book, that can make it hard for me to care. I reached the halfway point of this book back in June, and then stopped because I was heading towards a reading slump, and couldn't find a reason to continue. This isn't to say I won't try to revisit the story in the future, but for now, it's shelved, because there are other books I want to read more. Thankfully, it is rare for me to be truly disappointed in a book, and DNFing isn't something I do often. Whether it was my own taste, or the writing which affected my perception of these books, I liked most of them, and wouldn't be opposed to revisiting them in the future. It's always tough when you don't love something others rave about, but I can understand why people adore these stories, and I'm happy to praise them myself for what they did right. All that said, while I'm an open-minded reader, I do, as this video proves, DNF on occasion, and in the video on the left, I discuss why I'll DNF a book. Thank you for watching, and happy reading!